Hello and welcome to another solo episode today. And this will be part one of two, where I talk about the Cleft Collective and explain the research that they are doing. So, in the next episode, I'm talking about some of the findings. And today, I talk through everything we need to know about the Cleft Collective. But before we get started, I just have a little plea or a little ask for you. If you are listening to this podcast and you're enjoying it, could you please leave a review on the podcast platform that you are using? This way, other parents of cleft affected babies or cleft affected individuals themselves can find the podcast and we can help as many people as possible. I'm also always looking forward to any feedback, or if you have any ideas for future episodes, please always get in touch with me. You can find me on my Instagram, or you can also contact me on anja@anjapaune.com. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you. So now let's get started with the episode. You may have heard of the Cleft Collective shortly after you received your diagnosis or after the baby was born. And you may have been asked if you want to contribute to some research into cleft. The Cleft Collective is a UK-wide research program, and it's trying to understand the causes of the cleft, what are the best treatments, and also what is the long-term well-being of cleft-affected individuals. And when we first received the diagnosis, everyone is obviously asking what has caused it. Is it something that could have been prevented? And as you all know, for now, we don't really understand the cause. And because we don't understand the cause, we also don't know what could have prevented it, if there is anything. But obviously, everyone is very interested in understanding this. And this is really one of the reasons why this research has been set up, to understand the causes maybe one day. Likewise, we obviously want our babies to receive the best care possible. But there are actually quite many different surgical techniques for closing a cleft. For example, in some places, they would be closing the palate first and then close the lip afterwards. In other places, they do it the other way around. There are also many different surgical techniques for closing the lip or closing the palate. So, to understand what is actually the best technique, you need to gather data on a lot of different children, and they have been going through these treatments, and you have to follow them up longer in their lifetime to see how are they doing after 1 year, how are they doing after 5 years, how are they doing after 10 years, to really understand what is the best treatment, and likewise, what are the long-term outcomes for those that went through these operations. And this is where this research is coming from. So the Cleft Collective is actually the largest cleft lip and palate research program in the whole world. And what's really astonishing is that they are completely funded by charities and supported by voluntary contributions. So I find that really amazing that it's such a big program and it's not a government funded program. It's just all charity and voluntary contributions. This program is collaborating with some universities, so they include the University of Bristol, the University of Manchester, Central Manchester University Hospitals, NHS Foundation Trust, and also the University of the West of England. And this whole study is set up in two cohorts, which means two groups of people. And it's either a birth cohort, which means children will be included into the study just after the child had received the diagnosis, so that they can already be aware when you got your diagnosis at the 20-week scan or just after the baby is born. Families will be asked if they want to participate in the research, and then they get included in the birth cohort, or children that will have their 5th birthday in the year of being contacted. So that's the 5-year cohort. And then either of these cohorts will be followed along as the children grow older. The families will provide some biological samples, and they will also be asked to complete questionnaires. at appropriate time points. The families will also be asked if they're allowed to share medical records, and that would then mean that it can also be linked up with all the information that the hospital holds on the children, for example, and the hospitals would know exactly what type of surgical techniques, for example, were used. So that can all be linked up to follow along. There will also be questions on other people in the family being affected by cleft, for example, and this really helps. We know there is some genetic link, but also some questions that will also hopefully help in the future to just understand better where it's coming from. Likewise, scientists believe that there is an environmental cause of cleft. So again, the questions that they're asking there about where people are living and so on will hopefully help in the future to understand what exactly might be in the environment that may be causing it. Birth cohort itself is split up into two parts or two different subgroups within that. And it's either postnatal recruitment, so when the baby is included into that cohort after the baby is born. And for those ones, they would collect a saliva sample from the parent and ask the parent to fill in some questionnaires. And then from the baby, they would collect blood at the time of the surgery and also discarded lip or palate tissue at the time of surgery. And then there's also the antenatal recruitment. So in this case, we already know that the baby will be born with a cleft. So those babies can be included already at the point of the diagnosis at the scan. And here again, the parents provide saliva and questionnaires. And from the baby, they will collect blood and the discarded lip or palate tissue at the surgery. But also at birth, actually, they collect some cord blood. So the blood that remains in the placenta and the umbilical cord after the baby is born. Now, we actually agreed to provide data for the Cleft Collective birth study already while I was still pregnant. But somehow they still messed it up. So our cord blood wasn't actually collected. And I only got the postnatal diagnosis inclusion. So they didn't collect blood at the birth and included our son in the postnatal diagnosis group. I'm actually also not sure if they really have collected any tissue from him at the surgery. So again, there might have been a breakdown in communication between the Cleft Collective and the hospital where the surgery was conducted. I do hope, in general, the families who are included in the study, they're actually followed up and they do collect all the tissues that the families have agreed to provide, because that is really the whole purpose of this Cleft Collective, to collect as many data as they possibly can. Some families will also be asked if they could provide saliva samples from siblings, and that again will help to understand the genetic causes, because obviously both the baby and the sibling will be related to the parent, so they have the same genetic makeup in some sense, but then one child got a cleft and the other one didn't. So again, having samples from a baby that is affected and the sibling can help research to understand or look more into detail of that genetic link. Should maybe explain, from the saliva and from the blood, you can then extract the DNA, and then they can look really in detail at all the nucleotides that are making up certain areas of the DNA to understand what is different between children that are not affected and children that are affected. Once you agree to participate in the research, you will receive a starter pack that includes all the information about the study again, and it also includes the consent form. So again, you fill that in and return that to the Cleft team. Then the parents were also asked to complete the questionnaires and return them to the researchers. And for us, it happened at the same time that we were also asked to provide our saliva samples. So those were saliva samples from the parents only. So here it wasn't from the baby or a sibling in our case, but that may differ. And then they would have collected blood and tissue from our son at his surgery, although we were not informed if that actually happened, so I can't say for certain that happened. Then they will analyze our data. At this point, it's all anonymous, so they will have a certain code that they still can link together the parents to the baby and so on, but it's all completely anonymous. And they analyze the biological samples and the questionnaire data. And what they also will do is to link it up to the medical records. And then as children get older, the parents will also be asked if they allow to link it to any educational records that they hold on the child to follow their educational progress as well. So at this point, everything stays anonymous and they're reporting the findings on an anonymous basis. The families will be asked if they want to take part in any further cleft-related studies, and they will also be asked to complete questionnaires at certain points in the future so the researchers can continue to follow the families as the children grow up. So the aim is to get data on when the child is 18 months, 3 years, 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, 12 years, and 15 years. There's also the hope to follow up families even longer than that, but it really depends on the funding that is available for the Cleft Collective research. The participation in the research is completely voluntary, so no one has to join the Cleft Collective, no one has to share the data. It's really totally voluntary. You will be asked if you want to participate. Even if you started at some point, you can always withdraw your consent and stop providing information. It's all completely a choice. But if you do, know that your data will contribute to the research to help understand what may be a cause for the cleft, what are the best treatments, and how are they doing as the children grow up. There is no direct advantage to you or your child if you're taking part, but you will help to provide improved knowledge and support for all those affected by cleft lip and or palate in the coming years. There are no major disadvantages of taking part in the study. It obviously requires some of your time, but the research will not interfere with the cleft treatment, and it will just take place alongside the normal treatment, and filling in the questionnaires can be done from your home. The very first questionnaire that you receive for the parent is actually quite extensive. There were a lot of questions. So the one that I had, the postnatal questionnaire for the mother, for example, is 56 pages long. But some it's just a tick box, so some you can get through quite quickly. But for example, section A asks all about you. So it's asking about your ethnicity and where you were born, if you lived in the UK, what is your religion. And then it's asking specifically about when the baby was conceived. So how old were you? But now it's also asking about your parents. So how old were they when they conceived you, for example? It's asking about the type of cleft. And then section B asks about your work and education. And again, that's probably linking more to the environmental factors that may contribute to a cleft. It's asking about, for example, your relationship with the school teachers and so on. So it's a lot about your childhood. It's asking a bit about your employment, also asking about income levels. Section C is asking about your family life. So who else is living in your family? What is your living situation? It's asking a lot about your relationship with your partner. There is section 3 on your health and any illnesses that you have or that run in your family. Section E asks about your lifestyle and your dietary choices, for example. Section F specifically asks about your well-being, and that really focuses a lot on your mental health. And lastly, Section G is specifically to the mother, and that's asking a lot about contraception, menstrual periods, and things that wouldn't apply to the dad's questionnaire. Then there's also a specific questionnaire for the baby, but there are a lot of questions as well that may just not be relevant. So it might feel a bit odd to complete that just after the baby was born, for example, but you indicate how old the child is, so then it will be clear. There are some questions around walking of the baby, talking, and so on, which is not relevant when you do it quite early on or before the first surgery. But for the follow-on questionnaires from the age of 8, the children are also asked if they can complete the questionnaires themselves. So there will be then questionnaires for the parents and for the kids themselves to complete. But they also send you a voucher to say thank you for completing the questionnaire. I think it's £10 for a parent questionnaire and £5 for a child questionnaire. And again, I want to point out that this is not funded by the government or anything like that. It's all charities and voluntary contributions. If you have not been contacted about the Cleft Collective, but you want to participate in the research, then you can join if your baby has recently been diagnosed and they have not had their first operation yet. They could then get into the birth cohort. Or if your child with a cleft turns 5 years old during the recruitment period, they can get included in the 5-year-old cohort. So if you want to join, then please talk to your cleft team and they can steer you in the right direction. I will also leave all the information on the Cleft Collective in the show notes, so you find a link there and you can have a little read there about how to get involved. All families will be eligible to take part regardless of the type of cleft that the child has or the presence of additional conditions or syndromes. So really anyone with cleft can be included there, depending on the right timeframes. And they really want, ideally, all members of the family to participate in the research, so they just have as much data as they possibly can. But at a very minimum, they want to include the child with the cleft and the biological mother of that child to be included in the study. At the latest time that there was a publication based on that study, there were already over 4,000 children included in the data. People are also informed of the progress because they're publishing a newsletter. So you have the spring newsletter, the summer newsletter, autumn and winter. So every quarter there is an update on any new findings or how the research is going, really, which is also available to parents who can see what the research has shown so far. I've mentioned before how your questionnaires and your biological samples will also be linked to medical and educational records. So I really should also mention the CRANE database here. CRANE stands for Cleft Registry and Audit Network. And this is a database that collects information about children and adults born with cleft lip and palate in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And this database is funded by the NHS. So again, your contribution there or your data being accessed is completely your choice. So you can agree to it or not agree to it. They follow also the child's health and education by linking to the official health and education system records. And this linkage then allows for the researchers to have more information about the treatments that the children with a cleft lip or palate receive, as well as the outcomes of those treatments. For example, the children's educational assessments can tell a bit about their speech and language, which may have been influenced by the treatments and the healthcare they have received. And the data is never intended to single out a specific child or their treatment. But really what the data is aiming to show is to point out any gaps in the healthcare provision. So, for example, in terms of education, they could identify any gaps that then would justify extra support that may benefit children with a cleft lip or palate. And this information wouldn't be available to the local cleft team. So this is really why they need to collect it on a larger scale to see what are the outcomes of children with cleft lip and or palate, to see maybe where more funding is needed or where more support is needed, and really see that on a larger scale rather than based on an individual patient. The official records that are linked with the Cleft Collective research as well is hospital episode statistics or patient statistics. So when the patients go to the hospital, how long they stayed in the hospital for, what diagnosis that they have, and what treatment that they have. And then they also get data from the Department of Education, like I said. So that's information from schools about population, social and economic factors, school attendance, school attainment, and special educational needs. They will also get the data from the newborn hearing screening or any dental data. And like I said, it is your choice to participate. So you can say yes or no. And you can also specify, for example, that you agree to sharing the data in general, but you don't want to share the educational data, for example. So you can also pick out which type of data you're happy to share or not. And then as the child gets older, they can make their own decision about their own data as well. And I really like to point out as well that it's just a great system or a great setup that there is such a database, because in many countries that doesn't exist. And you can't really tell how good the treatments actually work, for example, or what are the outcomes after the children have received certain surgeries, because every hospital might just follow up their patients, but if patients are going to a different hospital for a follow-up appointment, for example, that data would be lost. So it's really not many countries where data are collected on such a scale and so comprehensively, with children being followed from birth up into adulthood, if the data allows. So we should be really grateful that we have the system, we have the Cleft Collective and the Crane database. And as an example of how the information that the Crane database collects is actually being used to improve care, the data had identified that over a quarter of babies with a cleft palate had their condition being missed in the first 24 hours of birth. So as we know, a cleft palate may not be seen in a scan, so that really is normally diagnosed after birth. But the data here had shown that for a quarter of them, so 1 in 4, that wasn't even done within the first 24 hours of birth, which means those babies were not immediately referred to a specialist unit, for example, that can just explain to the parents how feeding works. So this obviously caused unnecessary distress for the families and the babies, as those babies then would have had difficulties with feeding and gaining weight. So cost data had shown that there was a response to that, which was from the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health, and they worked together, for example, with the people working on the Crane database to now put together a best practice guidance to help healthcare professionals identify cleft palates in newborn babies. And following on from that, the Crane database has now shown that now there are fewer babies with cleft palate that are being missed at birth. So that's just one example of the type of information that the Crane database is looking at and how that information can help improve the care for children with cleft lip and palate. Again, I just want to emphasize that all the information and all the work from the Crane database and from the Cleft Collective is really solely for the benefit of the babies, the children, and the parents of cleft-affected individuals, and it is not for profit. So I hope this overview gave you a bit of an idea of the Crane database and the Cleft Collective, and why you may be asked to contribute your data to it. And then in the next episode, we're getting into the more interesting part of what this research has actually shown so far. See you then. Bye-bye.